Around 5 years ago, I made this knife for my mom. Well, actually, I made this knife, which ended up turning into this. Yeah, it was used a lot, and when I say a lot, I mean like every single day for the past 5 years. And also for every single purpose. Anything from cutting vegetables, to meat, to... But yeah, it suffered from a bunch of chips, which you can only fix by thinning the knife out, so that's why it's much smaller. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a pretty sharp knife. The proof is around my index finger, but it's still a bit outdated. I feel like I've come a long way since I made that knife, so now it's time for an upgrade. That was so bad. Alright, we gotta start by figuring out what we want this knife to look like. And to do that, we gotta get really clear on two things: function and aesthetics. Let's start with the easy one. One of my mom's favorite things about the old knife is that it is really easy to use and nimble. I want this new knife to feel pretty much the same, minus the drawbacks of the old one. Those drawbacks being not enough length, especially for larger fruits and vegetables, and not enough knuckle clearance. The knife should also suit the way that she uses it. She typically does push cuts rather than rocking the blade, so the profile should be flat. In summary, we're looking for a larger knife, but not so large that it stops being nimble. Alright, let's move on to the hard part. Now, aesthetics is not just about how something looks, it's also about how something feels. My goal is not to just make a beautiful knife, it's to make a knife that kind of feels like my mom. And that's obviously easier said than done. I mean, how do you even take someone that you know so deeply and then try to capture their essence in one object? So I experimented with a few different designs, see what I could come up with. Do I try to capture her compassion? How she cooks us food and brings us in as a family? How she's strict with me in a loving way when I'm being lazy? All of these ideas were just floating around in my mind, and it was really difficult to just put all of that into a single design. At some point, I just gave up on trying to find the ultimate design. And I asked the question, what part of her do I want this to reflect? And the first thing that came to my mind was how elegant she is. She's an incredibly tasteful person, especially when it comes to design. She dresses up pretty modestly and knows exactly how to bring out the most off of simple things. But behind her elegance, she's not necessarily passive. I notice that the most when she sings. She can put a lot of power behind her voice without straining herself. So I want a subtle yet bold element on the knife that reflects that. And finally, I want this thing to look feminine. I mean, after all, it's being made for a lady, so it should look like one. So with these design criteria in mind, I did one final sketch. I didn't try incorporating any other elements, I didn't try putting anything else, just those simple things. That looks pretty decent. Alright, now that we got the idea sorted out, we can go to the workshop and choose a few materials to work with. This part is incredibly important because these materials will be the medium through which our design is going to come to life. If I choose the wrong materials, I might as well not make the knife. We gotta pick a steel for the blade, a handle material for the handle, who would have thought, and a spacer material to provide some contrast. For steel, we're gonna go with AEBL. This thing is typically used in razor blades. It's tough, it's corrosion resistant, you just can't go wrong with AEBL. For my handles, I typically use wood, but for this knife I wanted to give this imitation ivory a chance. The color and the texture is absolutely perfect for the modest look that I'm going for. And for the spacer, I'm gonna use this aluminum bronze alloy that my brother made. He's made a few trinkets like rings and daggers with this stuff. He had some leftovers, which I gracefully stole. I could have just used brass, but I think his touch is gonna make this even more special. And also just look at the color on this thing. It almost looks like gold. It's gonna contrast beautifully with that ivory piece. Alright, we got our steel, our handle material, and our spacer. Now we can finally start making this thing. Making the blade is pretty straightforward. We just need to take our design and then sketch it on our piece of steel. I use a toolmaker's die so that I can see my lines better. Once the design is sketched, we can start grinding. Yeah, please don't be a moron like me and make sure that your piece is secure on your vise. Alright, with the bulk of the material removed, we can go to the grinder and finish this up. And here's the finished profile. This is basically a traditional Gyuto profile. Like I mentioned before, I wanted this to be more on the flat side for push cutting, but it can also do some rocking. Now all we gotta do is clean it up, and then we can take it to heat treating. Since AEBL is a stainless steel, it requires a proper heat treating oven, which I don't have. So I took this knife and a couple of other projects that I have to my friend's workshop, and he was kind enough to help me out. The recipe is pretty simple. Put it in the oven, heat it up to 2000 degrees or so, pull it out about 15 minutes later, and then do this really sophisticated thing where you put a piece of aluminum on top and then you just step on it. And then you do 2 additional cycles at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or so, and then if you're lucky you should get a pretty straight blade, which I didn't have, so I ended up fixing it with a carbide hammer. Nice and straight. Now we can begin working on the grind. I decided not to do anything crazy for this knife, just a simple convex bevel. It should be pretty thin behind the edge and also have a distal taper, meaning that the spine around the tip is much thinner than the spine around the heel. This allows the knife to do more delicate work around the tip, such as finely cutting onions and stuff, but also have enough meat around the back so, you can do more not so delicate work. With the grind completed 80% of the way, I can start blending the lines in. Now I can start working on the finish. My friend told me that it makes it really easy to hand sand the knife if you use a wheel attachment, and just do a few light passes, so we're gonna give that a shot. Yeah, let's try that again. Alright, this blade is pretty much 98% of the way done. It's not sharpened yet, so I can't cut myself with it, but the edge is thin enough where if you push your fingernail against it, it will flex. This is the perfect time to test it out and see if it actually performs well. A bit sticky, but that's okay. Yes, I was pretty pleased with how this one came out. Now we can move on to the part where we make this knife really special. Alright, we're gonna start the handle by sandwiching the spacer in between the ivory pieces. And that means that we have to cut the ivory into 2 pieces. My usual spacer pieces are precision ground flat stocks. This is a blob. So it's gonna need a little bit of work before we can actually put it in the knife. This thing looks edible. 1 million likes and I'll eat it. This thing took almost like an hour, but right now it's down to size. But the good news is we can make our sandwich. Now we gotta do the boring but necessary work of fitting the knife into the handle. And we gotta repeat this for every piece. Birds really be birding today. And we also need a few holes for alignment pins to hold the pieces together. Ta-da! Alright, now for the fun part. Look at all this cheese, bruh. That's from all the grinding that we did. Okay, now that we're done with the X and Y dimensions, we can start moving into the Z dimension. Meaning we're gonna give this a little bit of contour and depth. At this point I depleted all my grinding skills, so I'm gonna move into hand tools. God, this is taking so long, but we're starting to get there. With the geometry of the handle pretty much done, I decided to do a museum fit on the spacer. Museum fit is about making the spacer ever so slightly smaller than the handle material. This is typically intended for organic materials because they shrink over time, but the metal spacer doesn't shrink, so it starts digging into your hand. If you offset the spacer from the beginning, you don't really run into this issue. This doesn't really matter for my case because the imitation ivory that I'm using is obviously not organic, so it's never gonna shrink. Regardless, I think it looks pretty nice, so I just be using it on every single handle these days. Now I'm gonna add a small decorative channel down the middle. Now with everything down to its final dimension, I can start doing the detail work. When I was initially designing this handle, these little motifs gave me the impression of a flower, or maybe like a seashell? But the more I worked on them, the more they started appearing to me as the drapes of a dress. I don't know, I would love to hear what you guys think though. That looks pretty cool. Except for the top part, this part looks like the Eye of Sauron. I don't know, to me it felt like it was a bit too much, so I got rid of the individual lines but I kept the general overall shape. And with that, the handle was pretty much done. I just cleaned everything up with some sandpaper and rounded off any sharp corners. most difficult part of this build wasn't the blade or it wasn't the handle. It was the idea behind it. Trying to translate the feeling that somebody gives you into a physical object, it was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. I don't think the depth of a person can ever be reduced to a single object. But maybe if you're lucky enough, you can make something that resonates with them. You know, just something that they like. I hope I was able to achieve at least that. Let's see what she says. Ooh.
Açıyorum. Oh!
Abartma anne.
Hayır. Şok.
Beğendin mi?
Bayıldım. Bayıldım. Bayıldım. Çok
Beğendim.
güzel. Happy Mother's Day. Thank you canım. İçi çok güzel, çok beğendim.